Abandonment. An OEC technician who does not provide first aid care when legally required to do so could be liable under the legal doctrine of abandonment. Once you have started providing first aid care in an emergency situation, you should continue providing such care until all the care that is required has been given, the injured person has been transferred to another caregiver of equal or higher training and certification, Figure 1-17. The injured person has specifically informed the rescue that he or she no longer wants you to provide such emergency care. The patient is transported safely to a medical treatment facility, and continuing such emergency medical care threatens the rescuer's safety. Examples of abandonment include initiating care on an injured child and then leaving the child alone while you handle another accident, and leaving a patient awaiting ambulance transport alone in the aid room while the patient goes into shock. Once again, exceptions to the doctrine of abandonment are when providing such care could threaten a rescuer's own safety, or when competent patients have informed a rescuer that they no longer want first aid care. Negligence and breach of duty. Negligence can occur when an OEC technician harms an individual by not performing up to the technician's standard of training. Failure to provide care within the standard of training that is reasonable or imprudent, OEC technicians is expected to provide under the circumstances can also be negligence. For example, an improperly placed splint that results in further harm to the patient could be considered negligence. Therefore, it is important that a patroller exercise care and meet standard of training when performing first aid activities in order to avoid legal negligence. Once a duty to act is established, you are legally required to render appropriate care after you approach a patient. This duty of care is an obligation imposed on you as an OEC technician that requires you to be reasonable in providing any care that could foreseeably harm the patient. In many states, it is important to document evidence of any contributory negligence by the patient involved in an accident. In this situation, the patient actually contributes to his own harm. In such states, if an injured person was negligent in a manner that contributed to the cause of the accident, then the injured skier may not recover monetary damages as a result of the accident. A skier's statement that he or she was going too fast or I was not looking ahead could be considered an admission by the skier of contributory negligence and could prevent the skier from receiving a monetary recovery in courts. States that do not recognize the concept of contributory negligence might recognize the legal concept of comparative negligence. In such states, the legal system determines the degree or percentage of fault attributed to the patient and other parties, and then adjusts the monetary award for damages resulting from an accident based on those degree of comparative fault. In addressing either of these two legal principles, OEC technicians should fully document the circumstances surrounding the accident and any care rendered. The OEC technician should be familiar with the materials published by the National Ski Areas Association on documenting and investigating accidents. Assumption of risk. A legal principle that protects patrollers is the doctrine of the assumption of risk. This doctrine means that when a skier or snowboarder choose to participate in these sports, they assume that the sport has inherent risks. Therefore, if a skier or snowboarder is injured while skiing or snowboarding, it is their fault. In many courts, a finding that a skier or snowboarder assumed the risk is all that is needed to end the legal proceeding. However, the principle also the reason why accidents involving lifts or transportation of these outdoor enthusiasts by the snow sports area are of greater legal concern. The skier or snowboard might not be considered to assume the risk of being transported up the mountain, and thus injuries occurred while they are going up the mountain present a much greater potential for legal liability than injuries of those going down the mountain. OEC technicians should record the details of such accidents with great attention to how the accident was caused. They should complete the accident report in such a way that the forms indicate that the snow sports area made proper efforts to inform skiers how to go up the mountain safely. Many of the accidents that occur as skiers or snowboarders go up the mountain occur because skiers or snowboarders do not properly follow directions. If a skier or snowboarder does not follow the proper procedures, make sure that such information is recorded on the accident form. The same principle also applies to accidents that involve equipment such as snowmobiles. Collisions with such objects should be carefully documented because encountering this type of equipment might not be considered part of the inherent risk of skiing. Preparing documentation. As part of your OEC training, you will learn that document what occurred at the accident scene. This documentation is extremely important because it might be the only reliable source of information for reconstructing in court what happened at an accident scene many years later. Doing a good job in preparing such documents and accident forms is a vital part of your training and a critical part of the risk management of an accident scene, Figure 118. Proper documentation includes a detailed description of the accident situation, pictures, when appropriate, names of all the OEC technicians involved in working at the accident scene, and names, addresses, and phone numbers of all the witnesses. It is very important to document any statements the injured makes concerning the accident. Proper documentation and preservation of all the evidence are the best legal protections for OEC technicians and thus are skills that must be learned. However, to the extent permitted by the circumstances, OEC technicians should always record completely and accurately all the facts involved in the accident, as those facts are presented to them. It is part of the OEC technicians' learned skills in the risk management of accidents to preserve statements by the injured person or any witnesses concerning either the good job performed by OEC technicians or any admissions of fault made by the injured person. Writing down these types of statements is known as the preservation of evidence. Should an accident attended by an OEC technician proceed to litigation, both of you and the snow sports resort will appreciate the fact that the accident forms reflect the preservation of evidence. OEC technicians should understand that evidence that is vital to their protection can be destroyed by such events as changing snow conditions or replacement of signage. Therefore, it is important that they preserve all the evidence and accounts of the events involving an accident in a timely way. Preserving evidence is vital not only to winning legal cases, but it is in preventing such cases from ever being filed, Figures 1-19. Preserving all evidence requires good sense, judgment, and lots of patience, so it is important to take the time to do a thorough job in completing the accident form documentation. Write everything down on the accident from neatly, completely, and with careful attention to preserving evidence that supports the fact that the patrollers did a good job. Remember that media such as photos or videos are often helpful in documenting the condition of the accident scene, and that witness statements can be important in establishing what caused the accident. Most ski areas have a risk management program to preserve this type of evidence. Patrollers should understand what is expected of them when a serious accident that requires the preservation of evidence and additional investigation occurs at their ski area. Understanding the area's risk management system is a vital part of the teamwork a patrol and patrollers have with the area's management. Scope of training. As previously indicated, AOC technicians are trained in the NSP Outdoor Emergency Care Curriculum in the local protocols for emergency care required in their areas, and in the requirements of the state laws and regulations that govern first aid care. Some training, such as use of special equipment, may be unique to the local rescue unit or patrol. This scope of training will combine with what you have learned in the OEC curriculum class to become part of the level of training you are expected to perform in your local area. The scope of training may be different for different members of a medical response team. Emergency medical responders, EMR, and OEC technicians usually assess the patient, provide emergency life-saving care, and perform non-invasive interventions. Other medical providers may perform invasive or advanced medical procedures. It is important for members of the medical response team to understand their role and the limitations that are placed on them pursuant to the level of training, Figure 120. Standard of training versus standard of care. When providing first aid services, OEC technicians must remember that they are trained in the National Ski Patrol's Outdoor Emergency Care curriculum. OEC technicians and EMRs are not physicians and are not trained to provide advanced life support techniques such as administering drugs. OEC technicians are taught to use their judgment and, when the accident situation requires it, to request additional medical support from someone with a higher level of training. This is part of managing the legal aspects of an accident. However, acting within OEC technicians' standard of training is fundamental to reducing their legal risk. It is when OEC technicians perform procedures they are not trained to do that legal issues arise. Understanding the limits of the standard of training is important in reducing your legal risk as an OEC technician. Simply put, you must know your limitation. It is important to understand that the information set forth in this textbook does not define the standard of care of an OEC technician. The information only sets forth the standard of training that is taught by the NSP's Outdoor Emergency Care program. The standard of care an OEC technician might be required to perform includes the training set forth in this textbook, but it also includes many, but may not be limited to local ski areas protocols, the state emergency medical services restrictions, laws, and procedures and circumstances within the geographic area in which the rescuer works. It is each OEC technician's responsibility to understand these additional elements, which, in conjunction with the training set forth in this textbook, define the standard of care that OEC technicians should provide. In addition to the training OEC technicians receive in NSP's Outdoor Emergency Care, patrollers need to be familiar with the local first aid protocols established by each OEC technician's ski area. These protocols, which become part of the standard of care the OEC technician provides to the skiing public, vary from mountain to mountain. They are important because if patrollers do not perform under the OEC standard of training and the local protocol standards, OEC technicians might be placing themselves at legal risk. There is an exception when working either professionally or voluntarily as an OEC technician with OEC training. In most states, when an OEC technician is a physician, nurse, or an individual who is trained at a higher level of medical care than the OEC technician must provide first aid at the higher standard of care, being the standard of care created by training. Joint Statement of Understanding. When you work as an OEC technician at a ski area, you should be aware that you are patrolling as an agent of the ski area and not on behalf of the National Ski Patrol. The distinction conforms to an agreement between National Ski Patrol and the National Ski Areas Association in a document entitled the Joint Statement of Understanding. This agreement states that it is specifically agreed and understood that NSP does not control the patrol activities of OEC technicians while they are patrolling at their respective ski areas. As such, it is understood and may be asserted that the ski area bears legal responsibility for patrolling activities that fall within the scope of duties of OEC technicians. It is also understood and agreed that NSP provides educational training to individual OEC technicians in the classroom and on the slopes, including to, but not limited to toboggan handling and OEC certification. Patient's consent. Before providing first aid care, OEC technicians should obtain permission from the patient for that care. The same is true for any medical provider. When you approach the patient, simply ask, "May I help you?" If the answer is yes, then you have permission to provide care. OEC technicians should be familiar with several forms of consent, including express consent, informed consent, implied consent, and minor consent involving minors. Express consent is given when a competent injured person specifically gives an OEC technician permission to provide first aid treatment and transportation. To the competent and to be informed consent, injured persons should sufficiently understand that first aid will be rendered in order for them to make an independent decision. In order to provide expressed and informed consent, the injured person must be told what he or she is giving an OEC technician consent to do. So, as a general rule, it is important that the OEC technician tell the injured person what they are planning to do, so the injured person can provide the necessary expressed consent. When you arrive on the scene and approach the patient, simply say, "I'm David, with the ski patrol, may I help you? Once you have collected the history, ask, may I examine you, care for you, and transport you? If the patient says yes, then you have obtained express consent and you may treat the patient. Before rendering first aid, and if the circumstances permit, inform the injured person of the first aid procedures that you are going to perform, such as, I'm going to put your leg in a quick splint, so the injured person can provide his or her express consent. The concept of express consent can become complex at an accident scene. For example, an injured skier might provide a ski patroller with express consent to provide basic first aid. However, the injured skier might refuse to allow the patroller to transport him or her down the mountain. This situation involves both express consent and refusal of care. If there is a refusal of care and the patroller, using the patroller's good judgment, believes that the refusal places the injured skier at risk, and the patroller should create an accident form, and the injured skier's refusal should be carefully documented. Figure 1-21. Another type of consent is implied consent. In general, when an injured individual is not capable of providing express consent, implied consent may apply. Implied consent means that the patient would request first aid care if he could provide the consent. Figure 1-22. A classic example of such situation is when an OEC technician arrives at an accident scene and finds an unresponsive injured skier. In such situation, the consent necessary for the OEC technician to provide first aid to that skier. Other examples of situations in which implied consent applies are when the injured skier is delusional or unresponsive as a result of taking alcohol or drugs, and when the injured skier is otherwise physically unable to give express consent. In some situations, consent can be given by a spouse or a parent of an injured skier who is unable to provide such consent. Consent involving minors. Some states have determined that minors do not have the judgment necessary to provide express consent. In those instances, OEC technicians should attempt to obtain such consent from a parent or legal guardian. However, if a parent or legal guardian is not available, implied consent allows OEC technicians to conduct first aid and provide transportation. In addition, in many ski area, groups of minors provide group leaders or chaperones written consent to treat forms. Therefore, if a parent or guardian is not available, OEC technicians should look to the group leader or chaperone to obtain express consent after ascertaining that the group leader or chaperone has the authority to provide such consent, even though there are or may be no legal obligation to do so. OEC technicians should use their good judgment and try to contact the parent or legal guardian by telephone to keep that parent or legal guardian informed as the minor's immediate first aid needs.